Good morning. I'm Michael Foyer. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development here at the George Washington University. On behalf of my great faculty and staff and students, it's a pleasure to welcome you. My first assignment is to introduce a great American statesman, Congressman Robert Bobby Scott, who has represented Virginia's 3rd District, which includes, I am proud to note, the GW campus in Hampton Roads, Virginia, since 1993. Congressman Scott is in his 13th term. He's the first African American to be elected to Congress from the Commonwealth since Reconstruction, the second African American to be elected from Virginia. Congressman Scott, we are so honored to have you with us today. And the last thing we want is to keep you from the work of restoring sanity and civility on the Hill. So I'll keep the introduction short. Please welcome the distinguished Congressman Robert Bobby Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your very kind introduction, and certainly a pleasure to be here. But when I looked at the program, I was reminded of the old man that survived the Johnstown flood, and he was a child when it happened, and he's grew older and older, and he'd like to tell the story. And as he got older and older, he noticed that there were fewer and fewer people who were alive at the time who could actually validate the facts, and he took full advantage of that. That flood grew and grew and grew. When he died, he showed up at the pearly gates and said, "St. Peter, I'd like to tell a story about this flood." And he said, "Okay, we'll listen to it," and got everybody together. And he said, now, when you tell this story, remember that Noah is in the audience. I looked up, I'm supposed to talk about the Kerner report, and on the program, you got 2 people who actually wrote the report. You've got, I'm supposed to talk about education. You've got Linda Darling Hammond, one of the premier experts in education across the nation. You've got the Economic Policy Institute, who give me all the information I've got on jobs and other economic stuff. I'm supposed to talk about civil rights. You got the chair of the Civil Rights Commission. You've got Mark Maurer here. You can't give a coherent talk on criminal justice without citing some of the statistics that he developed. And finally, you've got William Barber on the program, who is the premier voice on the morality of public policy. And so I feel like that man after being told that Noah was in the audience. So in that context, let me say a little bit about what Congress is doing about education, criminal justice, and jobs. 50 years ago, President Johnson charged the Kerner Commission to consider 3 questions: what happened, why, and what can be done to prevent it from happening again. And so the commission began the analysis by concluding that the root of the disparities in education, income, policing, and other key areas was in, quote, the racial attitude and behavior of white Americans towards black Americans. 5 decades later, the old saying that rings true, that we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. Progress has been made, but there still remains persistent gaps in education, the workforce, and criminal justice. These gaps are due in part to the unfortunate choices made by the federal government when funds were diverted from the successful Great Society programs to fund the Vietnam War. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Just a few days ago, Congress made a policy choice to pass a $1.5 trillion tax cut where 83% of the benefits go to the top 1% in corporations. The president's budget shows how it's going to be paid for. Tax cuts going to be paid for by cuts in education, jobs, and safety net programs. In education, the Kerner report made several recommendations, including elimination of de facto segregation through substantial federal aid, revision of state aid formulas, and the vigorous enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There's been progress as a result of federal investment in education, primarily through Title I funding. We have seen that high school students are graduating at the highest rates ever recorded. Dropout rate is a historic low, and the greatest progress has been made amongst students of color and low-income students. Nevertheless, in 2016, the GAO confirmed that educational achievement gaps persist, and segregation is about as bad as it was decades ago and getting worse. Our nation's schools are resegregating by race and class and getting worse, not better, at an alarming rate. We've attempted to address the Kerner Commission's report by working to pass, about 2 years ago, the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA or ESSA, which reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and replaced No Child Left Behind. The ESSA requires the implementation of evidence-based strategies to identify and eliminate achievement gaps, and it's up to the Department of Education to hold states accountable to fulfill this responsibility. We're obviously concerned about cuts in funding for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. Meanwhile, I've introduced the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act to address segregation in schools. The main provision in that bill is to restore an individual right of action so that individuals can bring civil actions in cases involving disparate impact based on race, color, or national origin. Under present law, only the Department of Education can bring these kinds of cases. With regard to post-secondary education, the Kerner report recommended reorienting vocational education to emphasize work experience, training, and involvement in business and industry, and expanding higher education opportunities through increased federal assistance to disadvantaged students. To meet these goals, the House has passed a reauthorization of the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, which will transform the programs, making them higher quality and better aligned with academic and labor market demands. The House has passed the bill, and it's been awaiting Senate action. In fact, the House passed it last Congress and awaited Senate action. We passed it again this Congress, and we're still awaiting the Senate to act. There's also bipartisan support for additional funding for apprenticeship programs. Regarding access to higher education, I'm leading the opposition to a partisan bill to reauthorize the Higher Education Act, the so-called Prosper Act, which incredibly was reported out of the Committee of Education and Workforce on a party line vote. The bill cuts grant programs, requiring students to take out larger loans, and then makes it more expensive to pay back those loans. When President Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, he said something to the effect that this bill will mean that any student in any state can apply to any university, college or university, and not be turned away because the family is poor. Here you're making it more expensive to go to college. As the richest country on earth, we have the resources to ensure that all students have multiple high-quality educational opportunities. You remember, I guess it was about 2 years ago, Bernie Sanders offered a program, free college, at a price tag of $900 billion, a price tag so extravagant that most people just dismiss the idea as being fiscally irresponsible. $900 billion. As I said, we passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut. Nobody complained about that. $900 billion is $0.9 trillion. We had the opportunity to do free college, but we chose tax cuts instead. Even if we don't do free college, we have the resources to significantly increase the Pell Grants, support historically black colleges and universities, and come up with loan programs where repayment and forgiveness options allow borrowers to repay their loans without surrendering their economic freedom. In the area of employment, the Kerner Commission found that pervasive unemployment and underemployment are the most persistent and serious grievances in minority areas. In 2018, despite the fact that we have record low unemployment, the unemployment rate for blacks and Hispanics chronically exceeds white unemployment by a ratio of about 2 to 1. The Kerner Commission recommended the federal government develop job creation centers, create new jobs, remove artificial barriers to employment and promotion, and vigorously enforce Title VII of the Civil Rights Act through the EEOC. In response, we could create jobs if we make the right choices. The $1.5 trillion tax cut, heavily weighted to the wealthy, is expected to create 300 and some thousand jobs. If instead we had chosen to put that money into infrastructure, we could have created 20 million jobs. At the height of the recession, there were only 15 million people unemployed. Now the number is below 7 million. So with that kind of money, we could have, if we had made a different choice, virtually eliminated unemployment. One area that needs to be addressed is unemployment about youth. There are about 5 million young people, 16 to 24, who are both out of school and out of work. And so we need to make sure that we address that problem. In the matter of vigorous enforcement of civil rights, we unfortunately are going backwards again. The Obama administration had a plan for the EEOC to collect pay data. The Trump administration has reversed that. The pay data, right now the employers only have to submit data on their employees disaggregated by race. What they were looking for was add on the salaries. That would allow you to see instantaneously disparities in income. You're paying whites much more than blacks, men much more than women. You can't see that just looking at the number of people employed. Unfortunately, that regulation that was supposed to go into effect soon has been reversed. Again, we need to look at the budgets of the EEOC and the civil rights divisions of the Departments of Education, Labor, and Justice to see what the anticipated enforcement might be, and so far those don't look too good. On criminal justice, with regard to community and policing reform, the Kerner Commission was critical of the aggressive patrol practices, the indiscriminate and excessive use of force, and expressly condemned moves to equip police departments with weapons of mass destruction, such as automatic rifles, machine guns, and tanks. The Commission concluded that weapons which are designed to destroy, not control, have no place in densely populated urban areas. Bills to prohibit the Department of Defense from giving this kind of surplus property to local police forces have not been successful, and it just seems to me that if it's appropriate to bring in tanks and grenade launchers and that kind of thing, then it's more appropriate to call the National Guard than the local police. Criminal justice policy in general is pretty easy to do, but you first have to make a choice. You have to choose whether your goal is to reduce crime and save money, or to codify a bunch of slogans and sound bites that might help politicians get elected, but only serve to load up the prisons, waste money, and do nothing to reduce crime. Unfortunately, politicians peddling poll-tested slogans and sound bites are winning. 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimum sentences, and if you can get it to rhyme, it's even better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. That little rhyme has been studied ad nauseum, and all the conclusions are that it will increase the crime rate. These slogans and sound bites have gotten the United States to #1 in the world in incarceration, 20 to 25% of the world's prisoners, despite only representing 5% of the population. So many people in jail that there's studies that show that the incarceration rate is actually counterproductive. You're getting so little criminal justice benefit from it, but you're increasing crime by having so many children being raised by parents in prison. People with felony records can't find jobs. So much of the Department of Justice budget going to prisons that aren't doing anything that could have been put to better use to actually reduce crime. A lot of this policy has been exacerbated by the war on drugs launched by President Nixon and supported by just about every president since then. Now, because mass incarceration is not free, a lot of states have decided to change and make the better choice and go to things that will actually reduce crime and save money. Texas led the charge when their appropriations committee was told that they need to come up with $2 billion to keep up with the growing prison population. $2 billion, one state. Somebody said, well, if you spend about 10% of that on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, you might not have to end up spending all $2 billion. So in desperation, they tried. Spent $200 million, prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, and they looked up They didn't need to build any new prisons. In fact, they were able to close some of the prisons they had. That creates an interesting coalition. A lot of people like to save money. A lot of people would rather spend money on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation than waiting for people to mess up and then get into slogans and sound bites as to what kind of sentence they're going to serve. And so, based on evidence and research, I've introduced the Safe Justice Act that puts money into prevention, to reduce crime before it starts. Police training, after you've finished your debate about whose fault it was, what the police are doing, the answer is going to be police training. If you don't have money for police training, that debate was a waste of time. Bail reform, so that people who are charged with crimes can get out on bail based on risk, not wealth. A lot of people with a couple $100 spend months in jail because they didn't have a couple $100. Other people can get out of jail because they have money. It ought to be based on risk rather than wealth. When you get to court, problem-solving courts like drug courts, mental health courts, so that you can solve the problem rather than sending somebody, wait a couple of months and then right back, deal with the problem and solve it. An end to virtually all of the mandatory minimums in drug cases, which is a major driver of mass incarceration. If you want to know how bad the mandatory minimums are, you just look back at President Obama's commutation plan, where he had a plan and was giving commutation to low-level, nonviolent, essentially first offenders who had served 10 years. And he would consider them for commutation. Well, that sounds like a reasonable plan, except the first thing that ought to occur to you is how does a low-level, nonviolent first offender get 10 years to begin with? Well, more than 10 years, because at 10 years they still need help. Well, that's because the judge had no discretion but to impose draconian mandatory minimums. If you get rid of them, you can save a lot of money. Prison rehabilitation, rehabilitate everybody in prison, and second chance programs after they're out. The savings in mandatory minimums can more than pay for all of the things that cost money, like prevention, police training, and all of that. The elimination of mandatory minimums can pay for those. Now, there are other bills pending, but because some increase and then decrease mandatory minimums, others decrease and then increase other sentences, it's hard to see exactly what they do. But I would recommend, as you look at all these alternatives, to look at four things. What is the impact on mass incarceration? Get a CBO study and score and see how many people, fewer or more, will be in jail as a result. What do you do for racial disparities? Do you make them better or worse? How do you fight the war on drugs? Is it like we're fighting opioids with the public health approach, or like crack from a criminal justice approach, lock them up? And finally, are you using evidence and research or slogans and sound bites to develop your bill? You'll find that some of the popular bipartisan bills will fail on all four measures. Finally, on criminal justice, we have to do something about juvenile justice. The House has passed, House and Senate have both passed juvenile justice and delinquency prevention reauthorization. There's one little glitch that we can't get through the Senate, and that is elimination of the valid court order, where you, through a back door, actually lock up status offenders. Status offenders are those who an offense that is only an offense because of the status as a juvenile, like delinquency, underage drinking, and that kind of thing. There is no reason to put somebody in jail for those kinds of offenses, and we're trying to eliminate that. In closing, I would note the observation of Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, the distinguished scholar and psychologist, who said to the Kerner Commission, "I read the report of the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it is as if I were reading the report investigating the committee on the Harlem riot of 1935, the report investigating committee on the Harlem riot in 1943, the report of the commission on the Watts riot. I must again in candor say to you, the members of the commission, it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland, with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. It's my hope that today's report, Healing Our Divided Society, will get us off the hamster's wheel, and it will propel us to actually address and eliminate the racial disparities outlined in the Kerner report 50 years ago." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Scott. Words of wisdom, inspiration. Thank you so much for your service to our nation. Well, we have a busy day ahead, so I promise to be brief, no matter how long it takes. I want to start with a special thanks to our staff here at GW who have helped so much in organizing the logistics for today. Turan, Victoria, Jenny, and their team. Let's thank them, please, together. We are here to commemorate, celebrate, contemplate, and most important, to commit. We commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, its extraordinary architects, and its noble vision. We celebrate the progress, limited though it may be, that our nation began to make toward addressing the problems enumerated in that report. We contemplate the challenges we confront in the face of overwhelming evidence of unfinished business and unfulfilled promises, and the work that awaits us if we are truly going to heal our divided society. It is fitting to hold an event like this here at a university devoted to the ideals echoed in the Kerner reports. Our education school, for example, is a tapestry of programs and disciplinary traditions, but the thread that unites us is the goal to prepare leaders with the knowledge and skills to advance the cause of equity and excellence for our country's gloriously diverse population, especially in our communities and classrooms with the greatest needs. The report released today provides stark evidence that many of the problems identified 50 years ago have not yet been resolved, and that early gains have in many aspects been erased. Those data are certainly depressing, even to a congenital optimist like me, but I am encouraged by the powerful and perhaps audacious message of hope in the report, hope nourished by the determination to apply rigorous evidence toward the understanding and correction of our society's most vexing flaws. The philosopher George Santayana taught us that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Fair enough, but here's the thing. Memory and knowledge of the sort documented in the Kerner reports are necessary for progress, but they're not sufficient without action. We must be vigilant, we must be ready, and we must be together. So we need to move from contemplation to commitment. If we want a better way, we must find, fuel, and sustain our collective will. It is not a task for the easily discouraged. Martin Luther King taught, every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. It is my pleasure now to introduce three truly remarkable Americans whose lives and work have been models of tireless exertion and passionate concern. First, the great former senator from Oklahoma, Fred Harris, who knew that the riots of 1967 had deep roots and that we needed to understand them, and who persuaded President Lyndon Johnson to establish what became known as the Kerner Commission. Senator Harris is a believer in the application of research and evidence to social problems. He is the author, so far, of 19 nonfiction books and also 3 novels, and is a worldwide champion for civil and human rights. If you want to know what tenacity means, recall Senator Harris's words from 1972. A fair distribution of wealth and income and power ought to be an explicit goal of government. Please welcome Senator Fred Harris.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. The first novel I wrote, I was talking to a former senator, and he said to me, "I understand you've started writing fiction." And I said, "Yes." And a guy with me said, "I thought that's what he was always writing." You talked about persuading Lyndon Johnson to appoint the Kerner Commission. Then it had been announced that I'd introduced a resolution to create the Kerner Commission and had it sent to the subcommittee I chaired, and we held hearings on it, had Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who wasn't then a senator, and Whitney Young, head of the Urban League, to come and testify in favor of it. And then it occurred to me that the president could do that without waiting for congressional action, and so I began to press for that, and as soon as it was announced that he was going to make a nationwide broadcast to appoint a citizens commission to look into these riots. And so we brought a television set into the living room out here in McLean, Virginia, where I lived, and some people got some neighbors over to watch. And about 10 minutes, not more than 10 minutes before he was to go on the air, my youngest daughter, Laura, who was then in the second grade, came running out of the kitchen where we had a wall telephone, and she said, "Daddy, President Johnson's on the phone for you." Caused a little stir in the living room. I went into the living room, got the phone, and I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." And he said, "I hope you're going to watch television tonight." And I said, "Yes, we are." He said, "I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about." I said, "Well, I'm glad. I think that's the thing to do." He said, "I'm going to put you on it." I said, "Well, I hadn't expected that, but I'll work at it." He said, and another thing, he said, "Fred, don't you be like some of your colleagues. I appoint them to things and they don't show up." And I said, "I'll show up." He said, "One more thing, Fred." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, I saluted when I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I want you to remember you're a Johnson man." I said, "Yes, sir, I am a Johnson man." He said, "If you forget it, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut your blank off." He did not say blank. I went back into the living room and they said, "What did he say? What did he say?" I said, "Well, some of it was kind of personal." Johnson thought, unfortunately, and sadly, Johnson thought I did forget I was a Johnson man. You know, he rejected our report, misinformed about its contents, and himself terribly preoccupied with the Vietnam War. He rejected our report, would not meet with us to receive it. And that, I think, was very sad, especially sad, because of the fact Johnson did more against racism and against poverty than any president before or since. Well, I've been honored to work with Alan Curtis and the Eisenhower Foundation in bringing the Kerner Report up to date. This book, Healing Our Divided Society, is a kind of Kerner Report 2.0. And I just say, basically, it's about 4 things I could say quickly in a prefatory way. Number 1, we made progress on virtually every aspect of race and poverty for nearly a decade after the Kerner Report. And then that progress slowed, then stopped, and in many ways was reversed. So that today, as I'm sure you know, racial and ethnic discrimination is again worsening. We are resegregating our cities and our schools, condemning millions of kids to inferior education, taking away their real possibility of getting out of poverty. There are more poor people today than there were then, millions more. There's greater child poverty. Poverty is harder to get out of. More poor people are in deep poverty than was true 50 years ago. And income inequality is worse now and worsening. That's the message of this book is that's bad for all of us. And the book goes into great detail of why that's true. And it goes on to say that doing something about racism and poverty is good for all of us. And the book goes into detail about why that's true. But I want to just wind up by saying I'm heartened by several things that I want to mention to you and that we mention in this book. One is, if you look back to the beginning days of the civil rights movement under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King and people like John Lewis, who I think is a living saint, things were far tougher then than they are now. Jim Crow laws, for example, were the laws, not just practice. Racism was at its harshest. The odds were against them. But still, they resisted, they persisted, and they ultimately prevailed. And furthermore, the public opinion is on our side on all of these issues that we're recommending. The polls clearly show that. Furthermore, there's more activism in this country right now than I've really seen in my lifetime. The Women's March, Indivisible, Black Lives Matter. People want to do something, and they are doing something. And then lastly, Dr. King, I think, pointed us in the way we must go to try to put together the will and the majority to get something done. You remember that he was engaged in the People's March, was just beginning then, and the Poor People's March. And also, you remember that he was in Memphis when he was assassinated. He was in Memphis to support a multiracial garbage workers strike. And that Poor People's March, its slogan, as you recall, was jobs and freedom. I think one of the great men in the country, one of the great people in the country today is Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, the leader of this new Poor People's Campaign and of the Moral Mondays movement, which is rapidly spreading. And you're going to be hearing today from Reverend Barber. But I agree with what he says. We can't stay in our separate silos with, as he says, labor over here and civil rights activists over here. We've got to recognize that we've got common interests. And if we get ourselves together, we're a majority in this country. And as I always say, we don't have to love one another. I wish we would. All we've got to recognize is that our interests overlap and are in common. And Reverend Barber is showing that that's true. You can get people together across race lines and across other lines, gender lines and so forth, and make a difference. And that's what I think gives us some hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Harris. By the way, before I continue, just as a reminder for you who want wireless connectivity, the instructions are in your folders. Don't ask me how to do it. I'm now honored to introduce Dr. Alan Curtis, founding president and CEO of the Eisenhower Foundation, who worked in the administrations of President Jimmy Carter and President Lyndon Johnson, has continued to dedicate himself to programs aimed at reducing inequality, poverty, racial injustice, fear, and crime, and to improving education, job training, employment, and trust between the community and the police. Founded in 1981, the Eisenhower Foundation is a private sector continuation of the Kerner Commission and the 1968 National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Dr. Curtis is a social scientist with degrees from Harvard, the University of London, and the University of Pennsylvania. Please welcome Alan Curtis.
Good morning. Thank you, Michael, for your introduction and for being our host today. I encourage you all to hang around Senator Harris and try to have dinner with him. He'll tell you some real LBJ stories. The best presentation today probably will be by our fifth grader. But I first want to set the stage a bit more. Tracy Felder and Leela McDowell have done so much to make healing our divided society possible. I just want to praise them. I want to recognize and honor Fred Harris and Linda Darling Hammond and all our contributors. They've been noble and tireless partners. Our co-sponsors at the Learning Policy Institute and the Economic Policy Institute have worked long hours, and I especially want to thank Barbara McKenna. We are here today because of the visionary financial support of, in alphabetical order, the Casey Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and the Open Society Foundations. We will continue to speak out on healing our divided society throughout this year and next. The essence of the '68 Kerner Commission was that America had a long way to go in reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. 50 years later, we conclude that America still has a long way to go, but we have built up much more evidence on what works and on what doesn't work. We now need to generate what the Kerner Commission called new will among the American people to scale up and legislate what we know to work for the poor, the working classes, and the middle classes of all races. Over the 50 years since the Kerner Commission, we have twice elected an African American president. There has been a dramatic increase in the number of African American and Latino elected officials. The African American and Latino middle classes have expanded, and everyone has seen the movie Black Panther. Yet Mr. Coates, as Mr. Baldwin, speaks truth to power. Neo-Nazis have become emboldened in Charlottesville and many other places. Black Lives Matter has revealed what Americans did not want to see in Ferguson and in many other places. Zero-tolerance policing against people of color has failed. Sentencing laws remain racially biased. 200,000 people were incarcerated in 1968. Today, the prison industrial complex holds 1,400,000, and they are disproportionately people of color. In some ways, mass incarceration has become our housing policy for the poor. And that housing policy has included conscious, purposeful, government-created segregation. Child poverty and public school segregation have increased since the Kerner Commission. Deep poverty has increased, in part because of the failure of so-called welfare reform. Income and wealth inequality have increased and were accelerated by the supply-side created Great Recession of 2008. None of this has to be, we're saying in the book. There is today a new movement to base policy on evidence, not ideology. In terms of Kerner priorities, that means, for example, we need demand-side Keynesian policy that links job training first with job creation and job placement. In terms of economic policy, education policy, as Linda will describe in great elegance, we need school integration combined with more equitable financing of public schools and more training of public school teachers. In poor and working-class neighborhoods across the nation, we need genuine community policing. The community policing should encourage community economic development corporations to build affordable housing. The housing construction should create jobs framed as both employment and youth development strategies. The youth development should scale up mentoring and life skills training for at-risk high school students. The evidence-based models for doing this include Youth Build and Quantum Opportunities. After-school mentoring by neighborhood nonprofit organizations should extend down to middle and elementary schools, and all eligible low-income children should receive preschool. Essentially, when you think about that, the reality is that evidence-based policy that works is complementary and interdependent. It is not separate and unequal. The scaling up of what works needs to be financed by the scaling down of what doesn't work, like supply-side tax cuts for the rich and prison building for the poor. Criticized by the Kerner Commission in 1968, the media today need to better cover evidence-based policy. And the media finally need to recognize that the real story is dog bites man, not man bites dog. With sufficient investment in human capital, a new evidence-based Kerner strategy can reduce poverty, inequality, and racial injustice in a way that increases American soft power globally and that communicates to Russia, China, and the rest of the world how American values matter. Yet new soft power and new evidence-based policy cannot emerge without new political will. 50 years after the Kerner Commission, the creation of new will may be harder than ever to achieve. But we must begin. Some see things as they are and say why. We must dream of things that never were and say, why not? Reverend King asked why not. When he was assassinated in 1968, shortly after the Kerner report was released, his emerging vision was a multiracial coalition for economic justice among the poor, the working class, and the middle class. That coalition needs to be the point of departure for the generation of new will today. Reverend William Barber's Poor People Campaign Against the Immorality of Poverty and Inequality can help lead the way, as Senator Harris has already expressed. William Barber, Catherine Lehman, and Joe Stiglitz, our keynoters today, are striving to create new will, to make gentle the life of this world, and to remind us of the dream deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like a rotten meat, or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or does it just explode? Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. For any of my doctoral students in the room, let me say that I have Alan Curtis's email address, and if you want him to be your advisor, I'll broker it. Finally, someone who needs no introduction, about to be introduced by someone who needs all the introducing he can get. Linda Darling Hammond has been a friend, mentor, colleague, and inspiration to many of us for a very long time. I've known her since her days at the Rand Corporation. I have watched in awe as she combines her passion for educational progress with her skills as a researcher at Stanford in the National Academy of Education, and now as head of the Learning Policy Institute. Linda is the quintessential public scholar, a tireless fighter in the battles for educational equity and social justice. Linda, thank you for your work and for entrusting us here with this most important event.
We've had quite an overabundance of eloquence already this morning, and the day is just beginning, and there's so much more to hear, and I stand between you and probably our most effective speaker, so I'm going to keep this very brief. In the 1960s, civic activism was spurred by the civil rights movement, by the anti-war movement, by the horrors of ongoing police violence in our cities, the assassinations of JFK, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. For those who were alive in the 60s and engaged in this work, there was an overwhelming sense that change had to be made. And in fact, those changes, those events did lead to tremendous policy changes in this country. The investments in the Great Society programs, the war on poverty, in education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act were passed, the Desegregation Assistance Act, Urban Teacher Corps was created, the National Defense Education Act brought teachers into high-need schools. It was a transformative period of time. And in fact, it did increase employment, reduce poverty, significantly. Investments in cities created a renaissance in many places, and we saw the outcomes of those investments. And that's an important message that we can make a difference. In fact, the black-white achievement gap shrank by more than 50% during the 70s and into the 1980s. College going for whites, Latinos, and blacks was equivalent in 1975 for the first time ever before or since. There was a tremendous improvement in the quality of urban schools and poor rural schools. LBJ was himself a school teacher before he became president. Went to Southwest Texas Teachers College, taught on the border, and when he signed some of those education bills, he did point out that he was thinking about the students that he had worked with at that time. If we had continued on that path, the achievement gap would have been closed by the year 2000. Instead, these policies were reversed in the 1980s. The education gaps grew. Unequal funding of schools increased again. Segregation, which had been declining, increased again as desegregation orders were put aside. Poverty increased again. In fact, there are more poor children today, 60% more children living in poverty than there were at the nadir of that poverty statistic. In fact, there are as many homeless children today as would fill all of the NFL stadiums on a Sunday, with children left over to sleep under the rafters. Right now, about 1 in 4 U.S. children lives in poverty. For the first time ever in our history, most children in American public schools are eligible for free and reduced priced lunch. And that is the result of a set of policies that undid the gains that we had accomplished, that have allowed and in fact even encouraged the resegregation, the concentration of poverty, and the inequality of resources that plague our schools. The situation we find ourselves in today, which has so many analogies to the era of the late 1960s, is one that needs to be reversed for the survival of the nation. Inequality in all forms, including in education, is America's Achilles heel for all of our rhetoric of equality. While we undid those gains, many other societies around the world that were going through similar processes in the 1970s continued to move towards equity. And so when you look at things like the PISA rankings of achievement across countries, one of the drivers for the low rankings of the United States is the degree of poverty in our schools. And the heroic efforts that many educators make to deal with the trauma, the concentrated distress that that level of poverty brings. We should take several lessons from this history, that social activism can create meaningful change and progress, and that such activism on behalf of a renewed commitment to equity is essential for our survival and success today as a nation. Our social compact currently is at risk if all young people are not well educated and supported to contribute to society. In the 1950s, there were 20 workers for every one person on Social Security. Today, there are 3 workers for every person on Social Security. I am in that generation of baby boomers who are aging. And without every single young person being prepared to engage in productive employment, to pay high taxes, to pay for my health benefits and your Social Security, we will not be able to maintain the social compact that is the basis of a functioning democracy. In 2013, the Excellence and Equity Commission for Each and Every Child included this statement: if Hispanic and African American student performance grew to be comparable to white performance and remained there over the next 80 years, the impact would be staggering, adding some $50 trillion in present value terms to our economy, more than 3 times the size of our current GDP. This represents the income we forego by not ensuring equity for all of our students. Current activism, as the senator noted, provides hope. Black Lives Matter, women's marches, marches on behalf of the Dreamers, boycotts against guns, efforts to support voting rights, many new people running for office. It is time for us to take up the tools of democratic action to heal our divided society. And I am able and honored to represent that spirit of civic activism in introducing, on behalf of our younger generation, Chinori Kone, if you would just come forward, and I will meanwhile give Chinori a proper introduction. Chinori was born in 2007 in Houston, Texas. She is a 5th grade honor roll student at Gregory Lincoln Education Center in Houston Independent School District. She is the first place winner of Houston's 21st annual Gardere Martin Luther King Jr. Oratory Competition. Chinori thankfully believes in civic engagement, in running for office and voting to change things. She believes that young people who are committed to helping their communities should be convinced to run for local, state, and even national offices because we need sympathetic people who can change things. I hope that Chinori will be one of those. Please join me in welcoming her.
Look around you, on your street, in your city, or in your country. What do you see? Well, I will tell you what I see. I see people living in tents under the freeway and under bridges. I see parents going to jail because they used a false address just so their child could get a good education. I see people getting sicker and even dying because they can't afford the medical attention they need to stay alive. In the years leading up to 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. looked around and saw these same problems. It has been 50 years, and the situation for the poor, our education system and healthcare system have been virtually the same. The promise of Dr. King's dream of improving the lives of the poor and granting equal and fair access to education and health care has not been fully realized. If Dr. King were alive today, he would be proud of our country's achievements in civil rights. He would marvel to see our first black president, Barack Obama, but he would be disappointed in our large homeless populations, our failing schools, and struggling healthcare system. My dream for today's world is to eliminate poverty and for every human being to have equal and fair access to education and health care. In April of 1968, Dr. King planned to hold the Poor People's March in Washington. 3,000 poor people of diverse backgrounds set up tents on the Washington Mall. He wanted the top officials of our government to pay attention to the problems of poor Americans. He felt that the nation was more invested in the Vietnam War than ending poverty and building up its people here in America. In one of his speeches, Dr. King said, "It is estimated that we spend $322,000 on each enemy we kill in the Vietnam War, while we only spend in the so-called war on poverty $53 for each person who is classified as poor." My solution to these problems are very similar to Dr. King's. I want all of our top government officials to take poverty, failing public schools, and healthcare seriously. The way to do this is through political action and voting. Like Dr. King said, we must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. Well, I believe we cannot change things with some of the current politicians we have in office now. But like Dr. King, I have a dream. I have a dream that from the sincere, caring people here in America, they'll arise some young people who are committed to helping their communities. I believe if we could convince these people to run for local, state, and even national offices, then we could vote for them and have sympathetic people in power that can change things. If we can do this, then we will be the true realization of Chinori's dream. In Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King said, "I have a dream that one day right here in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers." Well, I believe only if these children who are joining hands are not hungry, have had a good night's sleep in a decent home, and have received the best education and the best health care, then we will be able to say that Dr. King's dream has really come true. Thank you.
So, Chinori, you have an offer to go to GW from the Dean of the School of Education. So normally I'd be worried about who will follow Chinori, but in this case I'm not worried at all because we are fortunate to have with us Catherine Lehman, my dear friend and chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Catherine has, in addition to chairing the commission, been litigating civil rights cases at the National Center for Youth Law, where she's been of counsel since October of 2017. Before coming to the commission, Catherine served as Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education until January of 2017. Before that, she was a leader in the ACLU in California, litigating school equity issues and cases, and generating an unbelievably creative set of ideas for how we can move the equity ball forward. She received her JD from Yale Law School, where she was the Outstanding Woman Law Graduate. She graduated summa cum laude from Amherst College. She credited her parents for her choice of careers. They were civil rights activists who inspired her to attend law school because she knew she wanted to make a difference. When one of her daughters was 4, When she heard her teacher talk about Martin Luther King Jr., she told her classrooms, "My mom does that." It's a pretty good thing to be known by your children for doing. She was Assistant Secretary for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights at the time. When she took on that job, she called the post her fantasy job, and she made more amazing, strong, and creative gains in that post than one would think possible in the time that she served, dealing with issues of civil rights, data accessibility, issues of exclusion from school, allocation of resources, segregation, Title IX. She left an amazing legacy that we really need to protect in the coming months and years. In 2004, California Lawyer Magazine named Catherine Lehman Attorney of the Year for Civil Rights. In 2007, the Daily Journal named her one of California's top lawyers under 40. The Chronicle of Higher Education named Catherine to their influence list in 2014 and labeled her the enforcer, which is, for those of us who know this brilliant and charming leader, we might not think of her first in those terms, but make no mistake, this is one tough, determined, and effective leader. On behalf of us all, we're delighted to welcome Catherine Lehman.
Thank you for that lovely and embarrassing introduction. And thank you to you and to Dr. Curtis for inviting me. And thank you all for being here and for the inspiration and the hope that it gives me to see you all together for increasing equity in our communities today and every day. It was amazing for all of us to hear our previous speakers. So I will do my best to talk about the ways that I, as a federal official, am trying to live up to your dream and to Dr. King's dream, and talk about what I think it is all of us need to do to make sure that we can give life to what the Kerner Commission promised us as a nation 50 years ago, and what Congress and we as a country have together promised ourselves repeatedly over those 50 years. The commission that I chair, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, like the Kerner Commission, was formed when we as a nation decided that we needed to come together to make real our equity promises. And the charge of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is, as the Kerner Commission's charge was, to evaluate the status of equity, the status of civil rights across all dimensions in this country, and to make policy recommendations for what it is that we ought to do as a country for effective federal civil rights policy. It will surely not surprise you that the Commission's earliest recommendations were parallel to those from the Kerner Commission, and the Commission's latest recommendations are parallel to those that are in this 50-year update report. That is both comforting to me in that we are like-minded about what our equity principles are, and enormously depressing that over these 50 years in the life of both commissions, 60 years in the life of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, we are effectively talking about the same things. We are effectively saying that we need this new will, that we need actually to make real our equity promises. And so I wholeheartedly support your endeavor and want to share with you both what it is that I see now in my perch at the Commission as the status of equity in this country, and what it is that I hope we together can do. A central conclusion of the Kerner Commission was that we are a national community responsible for each other, and that there is an essential federal role for sustaining that responsibility. We have struggled, as we know, to live up to the call of the Kerner Commission over these 50 years, but one core precept that has sustained over all of that time has been a belief in the federal civil rights promise and the obligation of the federal government to ensure those federal civil rights promises. Congress has passed many additional civil rights laws in the life of the time of the 50 years since the Kerner Commission, and we have held fast to that fundamental core conclusion that the promise of equity is a promise worth striving for. That set of basic precepts, that promise of equity is worth striving for, is tested more now than ever in these 50 years, and that is scary to me, dangerous for all of us, and worth our coming together now to work hard to course correct. The Trump administration fundamentally rejects the role of federal government in acting as a backstop against harm for all Americans. It takes the position over and over again that equity and civil rights issues are local issues to be decided without federal action. We in this room know that that is a failed policy position. We in this room know that the reason the Kerner Commission called for a new will to act was precisely because the vagaries of local decision-making leave Americans vulnerable to harm, lead to inequity. We also know that we have seen other times since the Kerner Commission when presidential administrations and Congress tested our equity ideals. Speaking for myself, I think of the Reagan administration as the nadir for civil rights before now. But what worries me now is that this Trump administration is taking a page from the Reagan playbook and accelerating it. That scares me, frankly, and that is what I think needs to drive all of us for a meaningful call to action. This administration works to destabilize the federal judiciary, appointing judges who are affirmatively opposed to federal civil rights enforcement and to federal civil rights themselves. This administration issues speech after speech and tweet after tweet, challenging equity principles and announcing that the administration will not enforce them. This administration generates dangerous policy and regulatory limitations on our rights. As I'll discuss in a moment, I am worried about our national health, therefore, and I'm deeply grateful to you all for reaffirming your commitment to equity principles. But as much as I want to share with you the urgency of these times, and I know that you all know it and that's why you came together, I also want to confirm that losing hope is not a viable option. I want to say it again, losing hope is not a viable option. It is true, as Thomas Jefferson is famous for having said, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So what that truism means is that equity is not a destination to be reached and to walk away from because we can check that box and we've gotten there. It is true for us that living equity at the desktop for students, in housing and workplace for adults, in criminal justice for all of us means nurturing that equity, means working to sustain its aspirational ideals and struggling constantly to maintain them in all of our lives. We do not get to walk away. We cannot ever walk away. That is frustrating to know. It is frustrating to recognize. And it means we have to come together. We have to stay with the fight because some progress is better than no progress. I agree that we have not done and achieved as much as we should have. We are not yet at Dr. King's mountaintop. And I didn't ride the back of the bus that my mother rode. I can try a hat on in a department store that my mother never could. I don't drink from colored water fountains that my mother drank from. We have made some progress. It's not enough. It's appallingly too little. And it's better than not having made any. And if we hadn't been in this fight, if we hadn't been working to sustain those promises, we would not have achieved what we have achieved yet, and it would be worse. So it is worth staying with this fight, and we can do it together. Having said that piece about the importance, thank you. I want to also just talk about what I see now in my role at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, what it is that we're seeing. The Commission is charged with being the nation's eyes and ears with respect to civil rights and to report back about what the nation reports to us about the status of civil rights enforcement. So here are some of our recent conclusions and developments. Most recently, we issued a report just last month about school finance inequity in an era of increasing concentration of poverty and resegregation. That set of conclusions will be very familiar to all of you and enormously distressing. The Commission majority in that report concluded that across the nation, public schools generally struggle to provide equality education on equal terms because they lack sufficient financial resources. We found that the reality of American schooling is fundamentally inconsistent with the American ideal of public education, operating as a means to equalize life opportunity regardless of zip code, race, economic status, or life circumstance. The headlines the same month that we issued that report and generated those findings included reports from Baltimore about children literally freezing in classrooms because the heat didn't work over and over again in those classrooms. The Baltimore superintendent said, I thought accurately and devastating, quote, "We all knew. State knew, district knew, city knew. We've had numerous reports that have talked about the age of buildings. We frankly had the blessing of really warm winters. But now, under pressure of extended cold, the chickens are coming home to roost. That is so devastatingly accurate and not at all limited to Baltimore. We all knew. We knew that those children were subject to harm. But we didn't have the collective will to take action that would make sure that no child in this country has to sit in a classroom freezing when that child is required to be at school trying to learn. Those Baltimore children are very like Detroit children, are very like children in San Francisco in litigation that Sophie Finelli, who's here in this room with me, and I litigated many, many years ago, who lacked decent school facilities. Those are the perpetual conditions of learning in close to a third of American public school students' educational experience. That is not the way you would treat any child you hated, much less the child that you love, the child that you believe has an opportunity and can become his and her dreams. So the reality is that in any week, in any school, in any year, we know that we don't deliver educational opportunity and that we mandate that those children be in school without educational opportunity, which means that we are sending them a message that their government does not believe in them, does not expect them to succeed, and views them as disposable. That is dangerous. That is distressing. That is totally anathema to who we say we will be, and we ought to change it. It is also the core reality that our schools are profoundly segregated. Profoundly segregated. What we have determined is that approximately 77% of Latino students and 73% of black students attend schools that are majority students of color, and that compares to approximately 88% of white students who attend schools that are at least half white. So all of these years after Brown versus Board of Education, we continue to operate profoundly unequal educational systems in terms of the opportunities that we deliver in those systems, in terms of who sits next to each other in those systems, and in terms of what we communicate about belief in our students. The commission called for Congress finally to act. There have been many, many, many years of calling on states to correct these harms. And we at the commission majority said, look, let's make education a fundamental right that is federal. Let's give each child a right to be in federal court to enforce that right if his and her school won't do it for them. In addition, we asked Congress to provide sufficient funds and to use its federal influence to incent greater equality in schools. I am confident that Congress is imminently going to act on those recommendations. But I do think it would help if you all were persistent in your efforts also to influence the degree to which Congress is hearing those recommendations. In addition to who sits next to whom in school and how much money we spend for whom in school, the Commission recently in December held a briefing related to the school-to-prison pipeline focused on discipline of students of color with disabilities in school. That is a topic with which I am painfully familiar from my life at the Department of Education before coming. It is also a topic with which I am painfully familiar in my life at the National Center for Youth Law, where my colleagues have been litigating and have been doing aggressive work in this area for quite some time. It is also painfully resonant across all of the years of the desegregation promises that we have held ourselves to loosely in schools. The very first desegregation agreements that the Federal Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education enforced with school districts around the country included discipline as a topic for the core desegregation principle. That is to say that as early as the middle 1960s, we were saying we need to not discipline students of color differently and more aggressively than we discipline white students in schools, and still, we're still in a conversation about whether that is something that is acceptable to us as a country, whether that is something that we will let continue. What we heard at the commission were devastating stories about children who are subject to exclusionary school discipline, who are subject to discipline that is apparent to their families, apparent to them, as focused on denigrating belief in who they are based on their skin color and based on their disability, as distinct from meting out appropriate classroom supports for all students to make sure that they can learn effectively. So I look forward to what the Commission will say about that topic. I am certain that our recommendations will include suggestions for ways to ensure equitable opportunity in schools, and I am pleased that we at the Commission can shine a spotlight on that topic among so many others that are core to civil rights Like the Kerner Commission, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has been looking at the ways that our cities respond to Americans and the ways that, in particular, our police institutions respond to Americans. I want to tell you about a few of those reports as well. Last fall, the Commission released a report about cities imposing fines and fees on residents. We think of that as cash register justice, meaning that our cities are funding themselves through the lowest income residents in the cities, and often through the lowest income residents who are of color in the cities, imposing dollar fines, dollar fees on them for criminal activities in excess of the criminal punishment, and for civil penalties well in excess of persons' actual ability to pay. The investigation confirmed at least a nexus between race and that cash register justice, similar to the Department of Justice findings from investigating Ferguson, Missouri, after the tragic death of Michael Brown 3 years ago. The reality is that the country was horrified when we learned about what happened to Michael Brown and what we learned about what the Department of Justice saw when it did its investigation of Ferguson, Missouri. And I think we hoped that we would not be like that community, that we would not treat our people the way that Michael Brown was treated, the way that Ferguson, Missouri was treating, in particular, people of color. What we learned in the Commission's investigation is that more than half of our states have taken very little action at all to correct their behavior with respect to fines and fees, even following the notoriety and the public outrage following Ferguson, Missouri. 5 states have taken no action at all. And what we see is that unchecked discretion for our cities to be able to fund themselves, to be able to operate the way that they elect to operate based on this cash register justice is profoundly harmful to low-income Americans. A 2017 survey found that almost 60% of Americans do not have enough money in savings to cover a $500 emergency, and fines and fees often exceed that amount. So we know that low-income families, low-income persons in this country do not have capacity to pay those fees, and yet we impose them, and yet we then criminalize behavior that isn't criminal, and we reverse the trajectory of otherwise productive lives in ways that are enormously, enormously damaging. In addition to looking at this question of the ways that our cities are preying on their own, we at the Commission recently held a briefing about the collateral consequences of incarceration, and those are the legal and non-legal impacts that accompany a criminal conviction. And we are still working, the staff at the Commission are still working on drawing conclusions from that briefing, but here are some of the key takeaways for me. There are significant impacts on marginalized communities from these collateral consequences that affect people of color, affect women, LGBT persons, and people with disabilities. We heard devastating testimony about how unlikely employers are to hire job seekers who have been incarcerated. We heard about bans on access to public benefits as a consequence of incarceration, of former incarceration, communicating a particular animus about which women are worthy of support and which women are not, and also rendering families unable to eat. And there is we learned in our testimony that came to us, we learned that there's a weak relationship between the consequences imposed and actually deterring crime, which ought to be the focus of criminal justice. For just one example, access to a driver's license is very often removed as a consequence of criminal incarceration, whether or not that driver's license is in any way related to the crime for which a person was convicted. There is, by contrast, a very strong relationship to harm to the persons affected in being able to become employed, being able to access housing, being able to sustain a viable life following incarceration and on reentry. So I look forward to what we will say about that, but I know that the information that we took in resonates with what it is that the Kerner Commission has evaluated originally and in this update. We also know that loss of voting rights is a very common consequence of incarceration. And just last month, the Commission traveled to North Carolina to hear experts discuss the status of voting rights in America. And we heard testimony regarding present-day impediments to access to the polls that are the core of why the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights exists, but also the core of whom we are as a democracy. Being able to vote, being able to participate in democracy is the essential way to know that you count as an American. And so to hear that you don't and you can't participate and that is still a core concern for us is enormously devastating to me. In May, the Commission will hold a briefing focused on hate incidents, hate crimes in this country, and federal enforcement with respect to hate incidents, both in the criminal context and also in schools, and racially, sexually, disability-based hostile environments perpetuating in schools. And I know that recent data confirms an uptick in hate incidents around the country, both in our schools and in our communities in general. These incidents were, of course, the genesis for the Kerner Commission in the first place. They are the reason that the Kerner Commission came together to evaluate the United States and to take steps in what was then seen as extraordinarily dangerous times. We are back in those extraordinarily dangerous times. Certainly Charlottesville was a public and visible reminder to all of us of how dangerous these times are, but the reality is that Charlottesville is unfortunately not aberrant, not alone, not by itself in what we see in schools. I expect that we will hear recommendations and also the experience of Americans about their conditions in school, their conditions out of school, in the ways that this uptick in hate incidents is affecting them. I will say that as a mom of 2 little girls, the day after the 2016 election, the school community, my children's school community, was already aware that it needed to be able to communicate that all children would be welcome there. My daughter's school had signs posted the day after the election saying, "You are loved, you are welcome here. This is a community that will welcome you all." I am so, so grateful that those signs were there, and I hate that they needed to be there, and that my daughters needed to see them, and that their school communities needed them. So I think these are dangerous times. I think these are worrisome times. And I know that we can do better. I know that those educators, the day after the election, at that dangerous and scary moment for the children at my children's school, they were ready. They were ready to be there to make sure that those kids would be safe and that they would be welcomed. And we need to do that in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in all of our communities around the country. We need to be ready. We need to be able to say that the progress that we have made was insufficient, but we're holding it, and we're going to do substantially more than we have done to date. That's why I do this work, and I know it's why you all came together. So I'm relying on you, and I'm looking forward to the ways that we will do it together. I have now fewer than 5 minutes, so I'm going to speed up with my thoughts about what it is we can do to make sure that we sustain this energy. At the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, we are using every tool at our disposal to make sure that we live up to the congressional promise that we will be there for civil rights for America. That means that we call public attention to the issues through the briefings that I described, through public comment, through statements, through speeches like this one, and we also issue our reports and recommendations to try to draw attention to what ought to happen and what we need as a country. We have state advisory committees in all of our states, so we are hearing more locally from people in those advisory committees about their expertise and about the conditions that are of concern to them. And we sustain a very broad area of focus across all of the civil rights issues I described to you, and many more, and that is to make sure that we do not turn our back on any component of civil rights that can affect Americans. We do see concrete effects of these tools. I made a joke about how quickly I think Congress will act on our recommendations. That was gallows humor. It's not actually funny. I do think that Congress should act right away. I will say that Congress has all of the federal civil rights laws that have been enacted in the 60 years of the life of the Commission have been influenced by Commission recommendations, and I am very, very proud of what it is that Congress has done to respond to the Commission's recommendations. Not always immediately, but certainly effectively over that time. We also are seeing concrete effects more locally and with more speed. So after the Commission issued a statement condemning the hate incidents in Charlottesville, in May 2017, the city of Denver, Colorado passed a hate crimes law adding sentencing enhancement for bias-motivated offenses, and they said it was explicitly in response to the call for action from the Commission. So I'm grateful to know that that happened. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention presented a report on immigration detention that responded to immigration detention recommendations from the Commission. So I do know internationally, locally, and in Congress, we do see response. And I say that to say, don't lose hope. What you stand for, the sunlight you draw on issues, the policy advocacy that you do on issues, the standing for a child who needs you, who doesn't necessarily tell you that he or she appreciates it, it's worth it. And there are ripple effects of those actions, and I ask you, please, to continue them. I hope very much that every person here today will, like us at the Commission, use every tool in your arsenal to stand for civil rights. Taking up that mantle of the new will that the Kerner Commission called for is our highest charge as a nation. And from my perch at the Commission, I cannot impress on you enough how desperately we need you to do it. We today stand at the precipice between whom we promised we would be at our nation's founding and to whom we formally recommitted ourselves each time we enacted civil rights laws over these past 50 years, and the dreck we could become if we turn our back on equity's promise. So let's don't be dreck. Let's do the right thing, and I'm looking forward to doing it together. Thank you very much.